Do you have any idea whose shoes you just ruined? I could buy your entire family and sell them for scrap. The rooftop gala at Thorn Plaza went dead silent, the clinking of champagne flutes vanishing into the night air as Julian Thorn towered over the pregnant woman on the floor. Beneath the blinding glow of crystal chandeliers, the city's elite watched in hushed shock. Julian didn't just want an apology, he wanted her soul. He snarled at his security team, "Throw her out, and make sure she never finds a job in this city again, not even cleaning toilets." He thought he was the most powerful man on that rooftop. He was wrong. He had just signed his own death warrant by touching the one person Dante Vance loved. If you love seeing bullies get what they deserve, hit that subscribe button right now and comment below where you are watching from. The air at the gala smelled of expensive cologne and cutthroat ambition, but for Elena Vance, it tasted like salt and humiliation. For 4 years, she had been the firm's secret weapon, the brilliant architect who caught the catastrophic flaws the senior partners missed. She was the quiet brilliance holding their biggest projects together. She was also 8 months pregnant. As she sat on the cold marble, her lower back throbbing with a dull, grinding ache, she didn't beg. She simply rested a protective hand over the swell of her navy blue maternity dress, took a slow breath, and looked up at the man in the tuxedo who had just destroyed her life. None of her coworkers knew much about her life outside the drafting room. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't mention family. When people pried, she simply smiled and changed the subject. Nobody knew. Nobody was supposed to. Nobody knew that the humble junior architect Julian Thorn had just struck was the sister of Dante the Ghost Vance, the city's most lethal underworld fixer. Julian Thorn had spent his life building empires, but in one moment of arrogance, he had ensured that by morning not one stone would be left standing. The sharp contrast between the glittering rooftop of Thorn Plaza and Elena's cramped second-floor apartment was a comfort she actively craved. Here, there were no crystal chandeliers or billionaire moguls, only the hum of an aging refrigerator and the warm amber glow of a single desk lamp illuminating scattered architectural blueprints. She kicked off her sensible shoes with a heavy sigh of relief, rubbing her swollen ankles before sinking into a worn armchair. This was her sanctuary. It was modest, undeniably so, but every mismatched throw pillow and thrift store bookshelf represented a hard-won piece. She had built this quiet, unremarkable life brick by brick, meticulously designing it to be invisible. A sudden, sharp vibration shattered the apartment's quiet stillness. Elena froze. It wasn't her sleek corporate smartphone buzzing on the kitchen counter. The sound was coming from a locked drawer in her desk, a heavy, rhythmic rattle that sent a cold spike of adrenaline straight through her chest. She unlocked the drawer with trembling fingers and pulled out a cheap plastic burner phone. Only one person had this number. She pressed it to her ear, not saying a word. "You're working too late, Elle," a voice murmured through the receiver. It was a voice completely devoid of inflection, smooth as polished obsidian and twice as cold. "Dante." "I have deadlines," Elena replied, keeping her voice low, a stark contrast to the thundering of her own heartbeat. "And you promised you wouldn't check on me unless it was an emergency." "The city is loud tonight, Elle. People talk." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken implications. "I heard a whisper about a disagreement at the Thorn Gala. Are you safe?" Elena closed her eyes, instinctively resting her hand on her stomach. Her brother's world was one of shadows, violence, and absolute terrifying control. Dante didn't solve problems, he erased them. It was a life she had sprinted away from, terrified of the day his darkness might inevitably swallow her whole. Now, with a child on the way, her need for that impenetrable wall between their worlds was absolute. She couldn't let his kind of help anywhere near her baby. "I'm fine, Dante," she lied, the memory of Julian Thorn's spit hitting her cheek making her stomach twist. "It was just corporate posturing. I can handle my own career. If someone disrespects you—" "No," she cut in sharply, her protective instincts flaring.
Don't. I mean it, Dante. You stay away. I don't want your life bleeding into mine. We agreed. A long, suffocating silence stretched across the line. She could picture him perfectly, standing in the dark somewhere, calculating, lethal. As long as you're safe, little sister, but remember, I'm always in the shadows. The line went dead. Elena dropped the phone back into the drawer, turning the key and praying to a god she rarely spoke to that she would never have to open it again.
Elena had always believed that talent was a currency that couldn't be devalued. By Monday morning, she realized Julian Thorne had changed the exchange rate. She sat at her small kitchen table, the glowing screen of her laptop reflecting in her tired eyes as she refreshed her inbox for the 100th time. Usually an architect with her portfolio, the woman who had saved the structural integrity of the Sterling Heights project, would have headhunters calling before lunch, but today the silence in her apartment was deafening. She picked up her phone and dialed a contact at Miller and Associates, a firm that had been trying to poach her for 6 months. "Hey, Marcus, it's Elena Vance. I'm calling about that senior associate position we discussed." There was a long, jagged pause on the other end. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. "I heard about the gala. Look, you're brilliant, truly, but I just got off a conference call with our investors. Thorne is a primary stakeholder in our new waterfront development." He lowered his voice, sounding more pained than malicious. "He didn't just fire you, Elena. He made it a condition of our funding that your name never appears on a project manifest again. Not here, not anywhere." "He can't do that, Marcus. It's a conflict of—" "He's doing it," Marcus said, softly. "He's calling it a reliability concern. I'm sorry. I really am." The line clicked shut. Elena felt a cold numbness spreading from her chest to her fingertips. She spent the next 3 hours making calls, her voice growing steadier even as her hope wavered. Each conversation ended the same way: a sudden coolness, a whispered mention of Thorne's influence, or a flat-out refusal to even take her call. By mid-afternoon, the reality settled in like a physical weight. Julian Thorne wasn't just content with firing her, he was erasing her professional existence. He was turning her into a ghost in the city she had helped design. She stood up to pace, but a sharp, stabbing pain in her lower back forced her to lean against the counter. She rested both hands on her stomach, feeling the small, rhythmic kick of her child. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about a career or an ego anymore. It was about the roof over their heads and the hospital bills looming on the horizon. She looked toward the desk drawer where the burner phone lay hidden. The temptation to call Dante was a physical ache, a dark lure promising a quick end to Thorne's tyranny. But she looked at the ultrasound photo pinned to her fridge and shook her head. She wouldn't let the ghost fix this. She would find a way to survive without the blood on her brother's hands, even if the world Julian Thorne built was trying to crush her alive. The walk from the subway had never felt longer. Every step sent a jarring reminder through Elena's hips that she was carrying a life Julian Thorne was trying to break before it even began. She clutched her small bag of groceries, just milk, bread, and the cheap vitamins she could still afford, and focused on the simple sanctuary of her front door. She just needed to lie down. She just needed to be behind a door that locked. But when she reached the second floor, her keys didn't find the familiar resistance of the deadbolt. Instead, they scraped against gleaming silver metal that hadn't been there that morning. The lock had been replaced. Elena blinked, her heart beginning a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She tried the key again, her hand shaking so hard the metal clicked uselessly against the new hardware. Panic, cold and suffocating, rose in her throat. She stepped back, her eyes darting to the doorframe where a crisp, white envelope was taped at eye level. The letterhead didn't belong to her landlord. It belonged to Apex Residential Holdings, a subsidiary she recognized instantly from the Thorne Plaza blueprints. "Immediate eviction notice," the bold letters screamed. It cited an emergency safety inspection and the immediate termination of the lease due to structural instability.
It was a lie, a cruel, calculated joke. Julian wasn't just taking her career, he was taking the very walls that kept her safe. I paid for this month, she whispered to the empty hallway, her voice cracking. I have a lease. She pounded on the door, but the hollow sound only echoed back at her. Through the small gap in the floorboards, she could see a sliver of her living room, her blueprints, her baby's half-assembled crib, the ultrasound photos still pinned to the fridge. Everything she owned, every piece of her identity, was now a hostage. A neighbor's door cracked open, but the moment they saw her, it clicked shut with a definitive, terrified snap. The word was out. To help Elena Vance was to invite the wrath of a man who could move mountains and crush lives with a single phone call. She sank onto the cold linoleum of the hallway, her back against the door that was no longer hers. The grocery bag tipped over, the milk carton bursting and spilling a white pool across the floor. Elena didn't cry. She couldn't afford the energy. She simply sat there, a pariah in her own home, feeling the heavy, silent weight of the baby moving inside her. The walls of her world hadn't just closed in, they had vanished entirely. Julian Thorne had erased her life, and for the first time, the darkness of the shadows felt less like a threat and more like the only place left to go.
The sidewalk was a blur of gray concrete and rushing shadows. Elena clutched her stomach, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The humidity of the city felt like a wet wool blanket pressed against her face. She had spent the last 4 hours shuffling from a police precinct to a legal aid clinic, but the result was always the same. The moment she mentioned Apex Residential or the name Julian Thorne, the air in the room would turn to ice. "Civil matter," they said. "Nothing we can do," they whispered, their eyes darting away from her swollen belly as if her misfortune were contagious. The world began to tilt. A high-pitched whine built in her ears, drowning out the roar of the evening traffic. She reached for a lamppost, her fingers sliding uselessly against the cold, grime-slicked metal. The last thing she felt was the jarring impact of the pavement against her knees, and then a terrifying, heavy silence swallowed the city whole. She woke to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a heart monitor. The light was too bright, a clinical, aggressive white that burned behind her eyelids. For a fleeting second, she felt the warmth of a thin blanket and thought she was safe. Then the sharp scent of antiseptic hit her, and the memory of the new silver lock on her apartment door flooded back, cold and suffocating. "Miss Vance, you're awake." A doctor stood at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at her face, he looked at a digital chart. "The baby?" Elena's voice was a ghost of itself, raw and desperate. "The fetal heart rate has stabilized, but your blood pressure is dangerously high. Stress-induced preeclampsia is a significant risk." He finally looked up, but there was no empathy in his gaze, only a sterile, professional distance. "We've processed your intake, Elena. It seems your health insurance policy was terminated this morning by your former employer. They cited cause, which nullifies your extension." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. I have a month of coverage left. That's the law." "Apparently there was a gross misconduct filing," the doctor said, his voice dropping as he glanced toward the hallway. "Look, I've been told I can't keep you here without a provider or a deposit. The administration is already flagging the bed. And because you couldn't provide a current permanent address, social services has been notified." The room felt smaller than the hallway she'd been evicted from. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as Julian Thorne intended. It was a machine designed to grind her down until there was nothing left to salvage. She was a mother with no home, an architect with no name, and a patient with no right to care. As the doctor walked out, the heavy door clicking shut, Elena looked at the IV in her arm. She was completely alone. The wall she had built between her life and Dante's wasn't a shield anymore, it was a tomb. And she realized with a chilling clarity that if she wanted her child to take their first breath, she would have to call upon the man who dealt in last ones. The hospital gown felt like nothing more than a paper shroud, thin and mocking against Elena's skin. Every beep of the heart monitor sounded like a countdown to her own disappearance. She looked at the small plastic bag of patient belongings sitting on the bedside chair. Her world had been reduced to the contents of that bag: a set of useless keys, a dead corporate phone, and the hidden burner. The room was dim, the only light creeping in from the hallway where nurses moved with calculated indifference. Elena reached for the bag, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the cheap plastic phone. It felt heavy, not with weight, but with the gravity of what she was about to do. By turning this phone on, she wasn't just asking for help, she was inviting a wolf into a city of sheep. She pressed the power button. The screen's blue light cast a ghostly pallor over her face. She dialed the only number in the memory. It didn't ring twice. "L," the voice came through, a low sandpaper rasp. There was no greeting, no warmth, just the terrifying presence of a man who lived in the spaces between heartbeats. "Dante," she whispered, her voice breaking on the first syllable. "It's me. I can't do it anymore. He took the house, he took the job. I'm in hospital and they're telling me I have nowhere to go." A silence followed her words, a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't the silence of a man who was surprised, or even a man who was grieving. It was the silence of a predator that had finally been given permission to strike. Elena could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a blade being run over a whetstone on the other end, a steady shh, shh, shh that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Julian Thorne," said Dante. He didn't ask a question, he stated the name like a sentence. "He touched me, Dante," she choked out, a single tear finally escaping. "He hit me in front of everyone." The whetstone stopped. For a heartbeat there was nothing, no breath, no static, just a void on the line that felt colder than the hospital air. When Dante spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave, becoming a whisper that seemed to vibrate in Elena's very marrow. "Rest, Elle," he said. The words were soft, almost tender, but they carried the weight of a funeral shroud. "The world is going to get very quiet for Mr. Thorne now. I'm coming for you." The line went dead. Elena dropped the phone onto the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had spent years running from the ghost, but as she looked at the shadows dancing on the hospital wall, she realized they weren't her enemies anymore. They were her reinforcements, and Julian Thorne had no idea that the sun had just set on his life for the very last time.
Julian Thorne did not wait in lines, and he certainly did not ask for permission. He strode through the private terminal of the city's executive airport, his hand already reaching for his passport. "Wheels up in 5, he barked at the ground crew, not bothering to look up from his phone. "I have a merger in London that won't wait for the weather." The pilot, a man who had served Thorne for a decade, didn't start the engines. Instead, he stepped out of the cockpit, his face the color of ash. "The flight plan has been scrubbed, sir. The FAA has flagged our tail number. They're saying the registration was dissolved an hour ago. According to the system, this plane doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to anyone." Julian's laugh was sharp and jagged. "Don't be ridiculous. Fix it." But the glitch was a virus that had already begun to consume his world. By the time Julian arrived at the Metropolitan Gala that evening, desperate to maintain the facade of his power, the air around him had grown thin. He reached for the bar, sliding his titanium credit card across the marble for a 5-figure donation. The waiter swiped it once, twice, a third time. "Declined, Mr. Thorne," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of the usual sycophancy. "Try it again. It's a limitless account." "It's not just declined, sir," the waiter whispered, leaning in as a few nearby socialites turned to whisper. "The terminal says the account is terminated, non-existent." Julian pulled out his phone to call his CFO, but the screen stayed black. No signal, no service. He looked across the ballroom, searching for the familiar faces of the senators and CEOs who usually scrambled to be in his orbit. He saw Senator Miller, the man who had helped him seize Elena's apartment, standing by the champagne fountain. Julian moved toward him, but the senator didn't smile. He didn't even acknowledge him. He simply turned his back and engaged in a sudden, intense conversation with a waiter. One by one, the lights of Julian's life were being snuffed out. His friends became statues, his influence a ghost story. He felt a sudden, frantic need to see his reflection, to confirm he was still there. He stepped into the mirrored hallway of the gala, but his phone finally buzzed in his pocket. A single text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen, illuminating his sweating face. "The structural integrity of your life is compromised, Julian. Watch it fall." He looked up at the mirror, and for a terrifying second, he thought he saw a shadow standing directly behind him, a tall, silent figure with eyes as cold as the grave. When he spun around, the hallway was empty, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. The ghost was in the machine, and Julian Thorne was being erased, one digital heartbeat at a time.
The transition from the gala's warmth to the warehouse's chill happened in a blur of motion and silence. Julian had barely reached the parking garage, his mind racing with excuses for his failed accounts, when the air behind him shifted. There was no shout, no demand for money, just two sets of hands, as strong and impersonal as industrial clamps, catching him before he could even scream. A heavy black hood was pulled over his head, smelling of oil and old shadows, and the world dissolved into the hum of a moving van. When the hood was finally ripped away, the light was so dim it felt like a physical weight. Julian was zip-tied to a metal folding chair in the center of a vast, echoing space. The air tasted of salt and rusted iron. Ahead of him, the only light in the room fell onto a scarred wooden table. Behind the table stood a man who didn't look like a thug. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Julian's car, but he wore it like armor. His face was a mask of terrifying stillness, his eyes reflecting nothing but the void. This was the man the underworld whispered about, the one who didn't exist until you were already dead. "Who are you?" Julian's voice was a pathetic, high-pitched warble. "Do you have any idea how much I can pay you to let me walk out of here?" Dante Vance didn't blink. He didn't even lean forward. He simply placed two items on the table with a slow, deliberate grace, a heavy fountain pen and a thick stack of legal documents. "You've spent your life taking things that don't belong to you," Dante said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to chill the marrow in Julian's bones. "You took a woman's career. You took her home. You took her safety. You thought you were the architect of her destruction." Dante nudged the papers forward. It was a transfer of deed, a total irrevocable handover of every Thorne-owned property, including the penthouse overlooking the city. "What is this?" Julian hissed, though his hands were shaking so violently the chair rattled. "You can't just take my company. This isn't legal." "The law is for people who believe the system still works for them," Dante replied, stepping into the light. The shadow he cast stretched across the floor like a shroud. "I am the ghost in your system, Julian. I've already burned your offshore accounts. I've already dismantled your boards. This paper is the only thing keeping you breathing. Sign it, and you walk out of here with nothing. Refuse, and you don't walk out at all." Dante leaned down, his face inches from Julian's. "You touched my sister. You made her bleed. Now you're going to sign away your world to ensure her child never has to know your name." The pen felt like a lead pipe in Julian's hand. As he looked into Dante's eyes, he realized he wasn't looking at a man, but at the inevitable end of his own arrogance. He signed. The ink on the transfer deed was barely dry when the warehouse's silence was shattered by the rhythmic thrum of rotors. High above, the night sky over the city began to pulse with the staccato red and blue of police helicopters. Julian looked toward the corrugated metal ceiling, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. He thought the sirens were his salvation. He thought the cavalry had finally arrived to rescue the great Julian Thorne. He was wrong.
Dante didn't move. He didn't even look toward the door. He simply pulled a slim tablet from the table and turned the screen toward Julian. "A gift for the authorities," Dante whispered. "While you were signing away your physical assets, I was finishing the decryption of your private server, the one buried under 3 layers of shell companies in the Caymans." Julian's breath hitched as the screen began to scroll through a digital ledger of his life's darkest work. It was all there. The bribery of city council members, the systematic safety violations, the millions laundered through phantom construction firms, and the offshore accounts that funded a dozen illegal political campaigns. It wasn't just a list of crimes, it was a map of his soul. "You can't do this," Julian choked out, his eyes wide with horror. "That data is protected by people who no longer work for you," Dante interrupted. "I sent the decryption keys to the Department of Justice 3 minutes ago. I CC'd the Internal Revenue Service and the press. By sunrise, there won't be a single stone of your legacy left standing that isn't stained with the word fraud." A nearby monitor, rigged to a newsfeed, flickered to life. The headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen made Julian's heart stop. "Thorn Empire collapses amidst global fraud investigation. CEO missing." Julian watched, paralyzed, as the empire he had built through blood and intimidation turned to ash in real time. He saw the live feed of Thorn Plaza being swarmed by federal agents, the golden letters of his name being draped in yellow crime scene tape. Every skyscraper, every gala, and every fawning headline was being systematically erased. He wasn't just losing his money, he was being deleted from the history of the city he thought he owned. "You're a ghost now, Julian," Dante said, his voice flat and final as he stood to leave. "No home, no money, no name. The authorities will find you here. They'll take what's left of your life, but they won't find a single trace of me." As the heavy warehouse doors groaned open, letting in the blinding glare of the searchlights, Julian was left alone in the dark. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had struck a pregnant woman in a lobby, and realized they were shaking. For the first time in his life, he understood the structural integrity of a lie and how easily it crumbles when the truth finally comes to collect.
Marcus Reed paced the length of his corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of a city that looked fundamentally different than it had 48 hours ago. The fall of Julian Thorn had been a seismic event, a digital and financial execution that had left the industry reeling. Marcus's own firm was trembling in the aftershocks. With Thorn's funding evaporated and his reputation toxic, the firm was a sinking ship. He had spent the morning desperately seeking a buyer, a savior to stop the hemorrhaging of his life's work. His desk phone chimed, a sharp, clear sound that made him jump. "Sir?" His assistant's voice crackled, sounding breathless. "The acquisition is complete. The new parent company, Vance Holdings, has sent over their representative to sign the final transition papers." Marcus let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for days. "Thank God. Send them in. I want to personally thank whoever had the courage to step in." The heavy oak doors swung open, but it wasn't a team of lawyers or a shadowy executive who walked through. It was a woman. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her navy blue dress draped over a silhouette that commanded the room. She didn't look like a junior employee anymore. She looked like the architect of a new world order. Marcus's jaw tightened, his face draining of color. "Alina?" She didn't stop until she reached his desk, the very place where he had told her she was a reliability concern just days prior. She didn't look angry. She looked centered, a calm eye in the center of the storm that had leveled Thorn. Behind her, a silent, tall man in a dark suit lingered in the doorway, a shadow that seemed to swallow the light of the hallway. Marcus felt a primal chill run down his spine as he locked eyes with the man, realizing instantly that this was the force that had dismantled a billionaire.
Elena placed a leather-bound folder on the desk. The terms of the buyout are simple, Marcus. Vance Holdings now owns 98% of this firm's stock. Your contract has been revised. Marcus fumbled with the papers, his hands shaking as he read the fine print. You bought us? With what? How? The source of the capital is as clean as the blueprints I refuse to compromise, Elena said, her voice cool and steady. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of the desk that was now hers. I'm not here to fire you, Marcus. I need someone to manage the mundane details while I oversee the redesign of the waterfront project. You'll keep your office, for now, but you'll be reporting to me. And the first order of business is a public apology to every employee you discarded to please Julian Thorne. She turned toward the window, looking over the skyline she would now shape on her own terms. You told me I'd never find a job in this city again, Marcus. You were right. I didn't find a job. I took yours.
The golden light of the setting sun spilled across the floor of the penthouse office, casting long, peaceful shadows over the blueprints of a city that was finally safe. Elena stood by the glass, her hand resting gently on her stomach, feeling the steady, rhythmic life within her. The world outside was still loud, still bustling, but the chaos of Julian Thorne was a ghost of the past. She had learned that while the system could be broken and power could be a weapon, the strength of family was a shield that no amount of money could pierce. Some lines are never meant to be crossed, and some secrets are kept not out of fear, but to protect the peace we work so hard to build. Elena Vance was no longer just a name on a blueprint. She was the foundation of her own future. If you enjoyed seeing a bully's empire crumble and justice finally served, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments below, where are you watching from today? We love hearing from our community all around the world.